I guess we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our December huddle. I'm going to share some slides. And I think Trevor's going to let folks in who are joining us. We still have folks joining. And I'm also, sorry, that's my kitchen timer there. I'm also going to just mute everyone because it's easier that way. And, you know, please stay muted during our presentation, and there will be time for questions, and go ahead and put your questions in the chat as they come along. Today we're going to talk about HJR 6, about Moore v. Harper, and very briefly both topics, and then we're going to get right into our conversation with Anthony Eid, who is on the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. Very exciting, and we'll have some time for questions there as well. So, as many of you know, a lot of us were at the State House yesterday. It was a really exciting day. I am not somebody who likes to count their chickens. So until the gavel comes down on the end of the 134th General Assembly, I'm not going to say anything for sure, but it definitely looks as if we have managed to push this off. The attempt to make it harder to for citizens to pass ballot initiatives. It looks like we've pushed that off into 2023. They may come back and try again, but we are feeling very proud of ourselves for everyone who showed up and everyone who spoke out to defend democracy. And as soon as the gavel does come down on the 134th session, you know, we will report out to you what happened. And we're very hopeful also about a couple of bad election bills that we really hope, you know, have not managed to make it through. But again, we will wait until we know for sure. Some of you also participated in our listening session for Moore v. Harper, and that was really, really interesting. The oral arguments lasted for more than 3 hours, which is 3 times as much as usual and 3 times as much as I was expecting. And that, you know, said something in itself of what a momentous case this is and how very important. Just very, very roughly, the justices kind of, you know, in their questioning, it kind of looked like they had broken down into about 3 sections. The Kagan, Sotomayor, and Brown Jackson clearly thought that the independent state legislature theory was nonsense, and that, you know, in following that pathway would have really very dramatic and bad consequences. On the other side, Alito, Gorsuch, and Thomas clearly, I mean, particularly Alito and Gorsuch really felt that, you know, seemed to indicate in their questions an acceptance of that theory. And Roberts, Coney Barrett, and Kavanaugh seemed a little bit more in the middle. Perhaps they're looking for some middle ground. Unfortunately, we won't know what the outcome of this is probably until as late as June. The important cases tend to come a little bit towards the end, you know, towards the last permissible days for decisions to come down. So we will be waiting. There were some very informative slides from Jonah Nobler, who was the person who had joined us to kind of give some inside information about some of the discussions. And we also did have a recording, and there's some articles there as well, in case you're interested. So, you know, a very important case. Thanks to everyone who joined us. And really, that's all I had for now. And I'm just going to turn it over to Catherine, who's going to introduce our guest today.
So I don't know if you remember when Patricia Sine came on, did one of our huddles, and she talked about what it was like to be a member of the California Independent Redistricting Commission and what that was like. And I just thought it was a really productive conversation. It helped us kind of understand what this is like and helped us think a little bit about like, well, if we were to do a commission, you know, what kind of model works. One of the nice things that had happened right after that is this guy named Anthony Eid sent me a Twitter message. And I was a little surprised, but I was really grateful. Now, Anthony Eid served on the Michigan Independent Citizen Redistricting Commission. And the thing that kind of blows my mind is he did 2 years of medical school, and then he decided he was going to become part of a redistricting commission. So a major life change so that he could be part of creating fair voting districts. And, you know, I'll really let him, introduce himself a little bit more thoroughly. But, I think we're really lucky to have him here today. I have all sorts of questions like, what's it like to be an independent on a Michigan Independent Citizen Redistricting Commission? What is an independent is another question. So with that, I'm going to encourage us all to put our questions into the chat. We might not be able to get to all of them, but we will do our best to get it to as many as possible. And with that, Anthony, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine, for that introduction. Can you folks hear me okay? Wonderful, wonderful. I'm just so happy to be here. You know, we are neighbors, right? Michigan and Ohio, large rivalry. We'll see what happens in the college football playoff coming up. But I just think there's so much we can learn from each other, given, especially how the redistricting process has differed, this cycle in particular. I think there's a ton we can learn from each other, and I'm glad to be here. So, my background's in science. Whenever we do a scientific presentation, we always have disclosures at the beginning. So there were just a few that were listed there. These opinions are my own. They might not necessarily be of the whole commission. Also, I'm not a lawyer, so there'll be some legal jargon, but I'm not a lawyer, so take those with a grain of salt. Next slide, please. So let's start off with some history. Most of y'all probably already know this, but in 2018, our commission came about by the passage of Proposal 2, which was a ballot initiative that was written by a grassroots advocacy group named Voters Not Politicians, which I got to say is just about the best name for any grassroots group that you could have. I think anybody can get behind that name, Voters Not Politicians. So it created our commission. We're comprised of 13 randomly selected Michigan residents. And of those 13, there are 4 Democrats, 5 independents, and 4 Republicans. And our commission's been responsible for redrawing all 3 of these maps, the United States congressional map, the Michigan State House, and the Michigan State Senate. And really, the core value of our commission is transparency. It is constitutionally guaranteed that we must be transparent. We did that in a few ways. All of our meetings were live streamed, and that's from the initial drawing where the 13 commissioners were selected to things like interviewing our staff and doing that process in public. And, I always kind of say, I feel bad for our staff because imagine being in a live interview streamed on YouTube to the entire state for an interview. It's very stressful, but that's what we did. And through that, we were able to hear what the public had to say about our applicants and hire our staff. All the way to the map drawing, which we did completely in public. We're able to take feedback from the public live. And another thing we did was also make available all of our mapping data the day that we did it. And new data was often added on a daily basis. So a little bit more about our structure. It was a random drawing of citizens. And I think this is an important differentiation between different commissions around the country. In Michigan, it's a random selection, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 5 independents. Now, you can compare and contrast this to other commissions that might have political appointees comprise half of their commission, or sometimes political appointees make up the whole commission. And in my opinion, that's not really an independent commission. All of us that were selected were just regular everyday citizens had next to zero experience in redistricting, very little political experience, and we're really just, regular everyday people. As far as the political affiliations go, they were all self-identifying. And Michigan has open primaries as well. So, it's very possible, as an independent myself, I think that, there will certainly be elections where I vote in the Democratic primary and certainly elections where I vote in the Republican primary. And that's because, we have these open elections. And another important structural difference that we have between other commissions around the country is that we needed 2 members of each one of those groups, plus 1 more to get majority in order to adopt any maps. That meant that there could not be a situation where, for example, the Democratic commissioners and independent commissioners could outvote the Republicans, or the Democrats and Republicans could get together and vote out the independents. That could not happen. We needed 2 votes of each group. So, Catherine had a few questions, a few comments why I applied. I'd always been very interested in advocacy. Back when I was in undergraduate and grad school, I was the student body president of Wayne State University. And through there, I kind of got more involved in the political process. And I really just, it was through there where I learned about gerrymandering in the first place back in 2018. And I remember, talking to folks around campus and telling them, hey, you should really vote for this. This is going to change the political makeup in Michigan. And, at that time, never in a million years did I think I'd actually be selected. But come time to apply, I put my name in the hat. And that's what happened. So our application had a few questions. It was, describe how you affiliate with either Democrats, Republicans, or don't affiliate with either. And I applied as an independent because there are candidates I support on both sides for different reasons. And I think as a country, we've definitely played up more so into this team mentality than looking at candidates, individual candidates for what they are. Politics isn't sports. I'm always going to root for the Detroit Lions, no matter what, but I'm not always going to root for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. I'm going to look at each candidate, see what they are, see what they believe in, and make that choice as, as far as they are as an individual, not by the letter next to their name. And then once I found out I was selected, one of the 13 folks that were selected, what really made me accept the position was that I looked at my colleagues who were accepted as well. I was the youngest commissioner that was selected. I was the only one with like a science background, and I really wanted to take a non-biased, data-based approach to redistricting. And I was one of only 3 minorities selected, being Arab American. We have 2 other Black women. However, all the other 10 members of the commission are white, which is fine, but I wanted just to make sure we had a diverse group of ideas, a diverse set of viewpoints, and I think we got that. So our big timeline, I kind of broke this down into phases. We first had our application process, the random drawing, and the convening of the commission. These 3 are above that blue line because that is what the Department of State handled. But after number 3, we took over, and we really worked independently outside of the Department of State. We hired staff. We underwent a first round of public hearings. We then obtained our census data, which is one of the challenges I'll talk about later, the census data being delayed. We then started to draw initial maps. We then took those initial maps on a second round of public hearing. We then took the feedback we got at that second round of public hearings and improved the maps. Finally, at number 10, we selected proposed maps and submitted those maps to a final 45-day public comment window. After that 45 days were up, we adopted maps. And that's where we're at now. At number 13, we're being sued, which I think was expected. But, it's funny, we were sued by both people in the Democratic Party and people in the Republican Party. So that kind of tells you, maybe we did a fair job there. And then eventually, after the lawsuits are over, we are to disband. A little bit more about the public hearings. we were constitutionally required to go to 10 public hearings before we could put pen to paper or mouse to keyboard in this case and draw any maps. Because the census data was delayed, we were actually able to go on 15. After that initial drawing of maps I spoke about, we then took them and went on 5 additional public hearings to let the public know how the initial maps were and to get feedback on them. All in all, through these public hearings and through our public comment tools, we got about 30,000 total public comments. And one of the things I'm most proudest to be able to say is that I read each and every single one of those public comments. And while I didn't agree with all of them, I'd like to think I took them all into account. So this slide right here is what I feel like, along with the structure, is the bread and butter of the commission. We had some freedom to make, the choices we wanted, but we had to adhere to this ranked order list of redistricting criteria that is enshrined in the Michigan Constitution. So you have the first two, equal population, VRA, as well as the districts being contiguous. Those are the two more federal statutes that we have that you guys in Ohio also have to abide by because they're federal statutes. But then 3 and 4 is where Michigan gets interesting because these criteria are higher up on the list of criteria than they are in those states. Communities of interest and not having a disproportional advantage for one party or another. After that, there's criteria that reflects not favoring or disfavoring incumbent officials, respecting city, county, and township boundaries. And finally, the last criteria is them being reasonably compact. You might ask yourself, well, what is a community of interest, right? I mean, it's kind of this abstract term, and it is a little abstract. In some ways, our commission had discretion to pick the communities of interest that we felt were best represented in the community and also best represented the additional criteria that followed it. But the constitutional language says that they include, but are not limited to, populations with shared culture, historical characteristics, or economic interests. It also says what they don't include. Communities of interest are not political parties, incumbents, or political candidates. And I think that differentiation is important. Some of our mapping tools, these websites are still up, so you can go and view them. Michiganmapping.org was a tool that we used to submit our public comments. On there, we took in feedback. Folks from around the state could talk about their community of interest. They could submit their own districts or even submit a complete district plan. And it used the District R tool set. We were kind of debating between District R versus Dave's Redistrictor, which one to use for the more technically inclined folk out there. We settled on District R because we thought it was a little bit more user-friendly, whereas like Dave's Redistrictor is a little bit more technical. And then after we submitted proposals during that 45-day public comment window, we had a second window on the right where folks could pin their comments on the map and get live feedback on how we were doing. So you might ask yourself, well, how do we organize 30,000 public comments? And the folks over at the MGG lab created heat maps for us in order to, solidify the public comments into different regions of the state. Now, this was made by Moon Duchin over at the MGG lab. And what ended up happening was that they found there were 42 different clusters of communities of interest around the state. And these clusters were very important because we could then take this data that we got from the clusters and overlay them on our districting tools to make districts that were centered around these clusters. And all that data is still available at their website, mggg.org. And not only do we use the clusters, but we also used specific public comments that were included in our public comment portal. Here on the left, you have our public comment portal. Somebody is a resident of West Bloomfield is talking about how they want their district to be centered around West Bloomfield and the surrounding cities. And on the right is the district in the final map. And the district reflects that public comment pretty well. Over here, you have a public,
Anthony, was this a congressional map? I just wanted to be clear.
that is a state house map.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep. This is also a state house map. This is a public comment centered around Dearborn Heights in Michigan. You can see what this user, this citizen, put out to us in the public comment on the left, and you can compare that to the final district in the map on the right, district number 15. And you know, it's almost a 1-for-1 match. And I was very happy we were able to do that. Here's another comment. This is one of my favorites in the whole map. It is a lakeshore community of interest. On the left, you can see what the folks from the lakeshore community submitted to the commission. And on the right, you can see that reflected in the final map. This again is the house map. And it kind of shows what a community of interest is. This specific community said, we're only through the lake and a few miles inward. We're not the whole rest of the county. We're just this strip of land that is along the water. We care about different things such as tourism, agriculture, clean water, things like that. And as you can see, this person's comment was pretty well reflected in the final district map. Here's a congressional district. This is a border community of interest. Folks from the border townships surrounding, Michigan and Indiana and Michigan and Ohio came out and, said that they rely a lot on interstate travel and rely a lot on traveling between the states, and thought that they should be a community of interest. The commission agreed, and we made, on the left, you could see what they submitted. There wasn't quite enough population for what they submitted, so we added to it to make the population work. But you can see district number 5 is a border community of interest. And I'll tell you, we got a lot of folks that said, they live in Michigan, but they shop, pray, and play in either Ohio and Indiana. And I think that was a pretty powerful comment. We also did things like undertake some pretty intense racial voting analyses. On the left, you have we were able to run a study where we identified where different Chaldeans are around our state. A Chaldean is an Arab American from Iraq who's of Catholic faith. I happen to be half Chaldean, half Lebanese. But there's no Arab American checkbox on the census. And in Michigan, we have a very large Arab American population. And by not having a check mark for being Arab American on the census, it renders the community essentially invisible and unable to advocate for themselves. But we were able to use different metrics and different analyses to study where those folks are. We did that in Dearborn and over here in the Sterling Heights area. You can see in darker green is where the Chaldean community is. And you can see District 57 in the final map. We did our best to try to concentrate that community so they could have a say in the person they're electing. All right, so now let's talk about the map drawing process. We kind of had 2 concurrent processes running at the same time. The collaborative process was a live round robin style collaboration between the commissioners to draw maps. And that was the main thing that we used to draw. This would be live over Zoom, over YouTube. I would take my turn at drawing one district, and we go round robin style around the table. My colleague would then either start their own district or perhaps edit my district. And we would just keep going like that, essentially in a big circle. And whenever we didn't agree on something, we would simply create a new map and have both versions out so we could then put them online and hear what the public had to say about both versions. Needless to say, this made a ton of different versions of maps that we then had to whittle down. But also concurrent to that process, we had individual commissioner selections as well, where an individual commissioner could submit their own map that they drew themselves from scratch to be taken up by consideration for the full commission. So we got the census data, finally, then we could start drawing maps. Now, we're at the point now in the process where we were taking our initial map drawing because we had to take these initial maps on a second round of public comment. And we ended up taking 20 different plans total. The collaborative plans are all named after trees. We wanted to take a non-biased approach to this process. So we decided to name the maps after trees because we thought that would be, a lot less biased than maybe naming them after, commissioners or who drew them or the community of interest that was represented. We decided on trees. It's Michigan. It was either going to be trees or cars, and we decided on trees. As much as I'd like a Ford Mustang map, we went with trees instead. And then you could also see the individual commissioner submissions as well. And those were named after the commissioner. So we took those 20 initial maps to a second round of public comments. These then became proposed maps. So we heard from the public about those 20. We worked on them and we whittled them down to a lower number of maps. Now, this was important because after this stage, maps would be proposed and they would enter a 45-day public comment window. And this is important because according to the language in the Constitution, once you enter the 45-day public comment window, you can't make any changes without restarting the 45-day public comment window. And we didn't have the time to restart another 45-day public comment window. So it was important that the maps we put on to be proposed to the public were compliant with all the state regulations and the federal regulations. So that's what we did. We went from those 20 maps to these maps, and these were the 3 collaborative maps for each type. So we had the Chestnut plan. That map was previously my own individual plan, but through that second round of public comment, we got feedback from it. And the commission took it up to then become a collaborative map. We worked on it together, made the changes that we heard. That is the map that ended up being adopted as well. We had the Perch and the Apple map. And then we also had 2 individual congressional maps. Then we had the State House maps, again, 3 collaborative versions, and the State Senate maps, 3 collaborative versions plus the individual ones. Now, I think it was important to the commissioners that we chose maps that were worked on collaboratively for a few reasons. One, it promotes compromise. By having the collaborative process, no commissioner got everything that they wanted, right? But everybody, even those that didn't vote to adopt the maps, had some input in creating the maps. And I think that was important to our whole commission. Even if some folks wouldn't vote on them, we wanted to make sure that even those dissenting voices were heard in the final map. And that's what happened. Speaking of voting, this is how we voted on maps. So we had these 3 methods. And it was really important to our commission that method 1 worked. And I spoke about it earlier. It's having the majority of votes and 2 members of each party being represented in the final vote. And the collaborative process I just talked about helped ensure that method 1 will prevail. But let's say method 1 would not prevail and the commission could not come up to an agreement on which maps to adopt. We then go to method 2, which was a ranked choice vote. Commissioners would rank their choice of all the maps. But even with that, the dissenting voices still must be heard because the final choice, the final adopted map had to be in the top 2 selections of those 2 members of each party. And then let's say that didn't work. There's a third method, which we kind of dubbed the nuclear option because nobody wanted to see it happen. And that's every commissioner would choose their most preferred map and it would then go into a random drawing. It would then go into a random drawing to be selected by random at the Department of State. And that makes me a little uneasy because random drawings from the maps, we didn't want that. So I'm glad that method 1 prevailed. And it's a good option because everyone's voice got to be heard. So here were the final adopted maps. Oh, let's go back. Can we go back 1 slide? Back, there we go. Another important aspect, especially when comparing to Ohio, is that we are never in a situation where another body is going to be drawing maps. Let's say, for example, the Michigan Supreme Court or the United States Supreme Court strikes down our maps for being unconstitutional. we're in 2 lawsuits. You know, it could happen. I don't think it will, but it's a possibility. A court doesn't then get to appoint a special master to draw the map. The maps will come back to our commission, and our commission would again go through this process and go through these voting procedures in order to adopt a map. So there's no situation, well, except if, you know, the Moore case ends up, you know, not well, that we're going to be having a different entity draw the maps. All right, next slide. So here are the final choices that we ended up adopting. We got the Chestnut congressional map, the Hickory State House map, and the Linden State Senate map. And this is that red and blue is from data using this last 2022 election. So it's a pretty updated map with the percentages of votes for each district. So someone asked a question, how did we measure disproportionate advantage? And that was a question that we wrestled with. You know, we started this process as novices, not knowing about, you know, anything having to do with redistricting. But we hired good experts. And what those experts told us was that there were a few different measures that the courts accepted in the redistricting process to consider fairness. So the measures that we used were efficiency gap, mean median difference, lopsided margins test, and seat share or seats to votes ratio. And on this slide, you can see our efficiency gap for each map compared to in red at the bottom, which was what the map was in the map, excuse me, the map that the Republican legislature in Michigan drew 10 years ago. So let's just look at the Chestnut map. It went from I believe it is a 17% advantage for Republicans. Sorry, a 12% advantage for Republicans. And we dropped that down to an efficiency gap of 0.6, which according to 538 is the lowest efficiency gap of any map in the country. This past election, you know, was interesting in Michigan because for the first time in 40 years, Democrats flipped the state Senate and are going to have a trifecta, having the governorship, the state house, and the state Senate. So we've been seeing a lot of media reports that our maps somehow advantage Democrats, but that's simply not the case. You can see from these metrics that in every single one of these maps, they actually skew Republican in 3 of the 4 measures in every map. It just so happens in Michigan that in this election, Democrats got a lot more votes than Republicans. And that's why they won. But it's a fair map. In the future, if Republicans get more votes than Democrats, they also will win. Here's what the Princeton Gerrymandering Project said about our maps. They are a third-party affiliate. Like I said, we wanted to take a really good data-based approach to redistricting. And they use slightly different data than we did. We took 10 years of previous election history and weighted them all equally, while this website weights more recent elections at to a greater degree than further away elections, which is something we considered doing, but in the end, we decided to weigh the 10 years of election history equally. And here's what they said for partisan fairness, competitiveness, and geographical features. So we got A's and B's across the board. I think that's pretty good. Here are also some, you know, what other folks said. So I think you guys are probably familiar with Nancy Lane, with Voters Not Politicians. It's a New York Times article that says, this is about taking our power back as citizens. That's something I agree with. Competitiveness was not a specific measure. It was not one of those 7 criteria that we had to follow. But it just so happens that because we followed the rest of the criteria, it resulted in a more competitive map. These are headlines that demonstrate the amount of competition that was in this election in Michigan compared to previously. You got the one at the bottom that says, you know, 9 legislatures tossed out by voters. It just shows we really did not favor incumbents or favor newcomers. We just drew the maps without them. Here's another slide. This is from 538 that again demonstrates the fairness and competition of our maps. You can see the new map on the bottom compared to the old. So just by about every single metric, the maps were a lot more fair. In this previous election, you can see how the voting percentages ended up compared to the number of seats each party won. So you can see for the state Senate, Democrats got about 51% of the vote. So they got 20 seats. Republicans got about 49% of the vote. They got 18 seats. You can see with the House, Democrats got about 50.5 and Republicans got about 49.5. A difference of only 2 of 110. And then congressional map, Democrats won by a little bit more, and it's a 7-6 makeup. And I think this just goes to show these maps are representative of the electorate in Michigan almost perfectly. I mean, it really is amazing compared to gerrymandered maps we had in the past, where oftentimes one party would get the most votes, but that party would not win the most seats. And that's what this slide demonstrates. You can see basically the farther apart the lines are, the worse the map is. And you can see in years such as 2014, where it was a year where the party that got the most votes did not get the most seats. But fast forward to 2020 and the lines are converging and crossing over, meaning that we fixed the maps essentially. It's not all good though. Can we go to the next slide? Let's get that one. There is we do have 2 lawsuits on our hands. One lawsuit is a potential VRA claim, claiming that we disenfranchised Black voters. But I don't believe that to be true. We took a evidence-based analysis towards these maps, and that included a professional VRA analysis. Can we go to the next slide? That VRA analysis was conducted by Dr. Lisa Handley, who's a very well-respected and well-cited political scientist. And when they undertook this racial bloc voting analysis, what they found was that when the maps were drawn 10 years ago, they were drawn in a way to concentrate Black voters into the fewest amount of districts possible. We were looking at 90% plus BVAP in some of the districts. When in Michigan, there's enough crossover voting for minority communities to elect their candidate of choice with a much lower concentration of population. We were then advised to draw districts for minority populations in order for them to elect their candidates of choice, but that's not always a majority Black district. So for example, in the 2 congressional districts around Detroit, in the Chestnut map, districts 12 and 13, they're not majority Black. They're still majority minority, but they're not majority Black. However, they were still most likely able to elect their communities, those candidates, candidate of choice. Those communities, their candidates of choice. And it gets a little tricky because in Michigan, we don't always elect people that match up to our demographic. For example, Detroit is a 70% Black city, but we've elected Mayor Duggan, who's a white man, the past 3 election cycles. And likewise, in District 12, they elected Rashida Tlaib, who's a Palestinian American. And in District 13, they elected Shri Tanadar, who is an Indian American. So they're not Black, but they're likely, and I say likely because we haven't done the analysis yet, but once someone does, I expect that they are likely the Black candidates of choice. Conversely, in the suburbs in District 11, John James won, who is a Black man. But I think once we do that racial bloc voting analysis on that district, it's probably likely that even though he's a Black man, he probably wasn't the Black candidate of choice. So it's definitely an interesting topic in Michigan, and we'll have to see how those lawsuits play out. So challenges. well, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, which, imagine, getting started. I'm sure VMP, when they first made this language, did not consider that there might be a global pandemic to hit us for the first time that it takes effect. That resulted into us having a lot of mandatory remote meetings, which resulted in a lack of camaraderie. We did eventually start meeting in person, and when that happened, you could really feel the difference. There was a delay in the census data, which really put us under a time crunch. And in the constitutional language in Michigan, we actually had a deadline when we had to submit maps by, but because the census data was delayed, it was just impossible to do that. So we had to go to court and get an extension for that delay. We could have had more primary election data. That would have been helpful. More data is always better. There were also safety concerns. This was a very public job, and something I didn't really consider coming into it was that just how public it would be. We had threats of violence. At one point, there was a very serious gun threat. Someone submitted a comment saying they were going to come shoot us all. And there have been a lot of public attacks, specifically on me and some of the other independent commissioners. I've had people come in and say, one day I'm a radical liberal, and another day say I'm a MAGA conservative. And it's really crazy. There's also the lawsuits, I spoke about them, and then also closed meetings. So all of our meetings had to be in public. And the only exception to that is when we had to talk about legal issues with our lawyers. So we used closed meetings very sparingly, but there was one that we used. I think in total, we've had 3 or 4 closed meetings just to discuss lawsuits. But the first one that we had, we were actually sued by some of the news organizations in Detroit to release that information, and they won that lawsuit. So we did then release the recording of that meeting and all of, the recording of the meeting and all the materials from that meeting. And that was a meeting that focused on potential VRA issues. So some lessons: have clear but flexible constitutional criteria. Have things like the ranked order criteria, but don't go so specific to mandate specific dates, because it could be a pandemic and we might have to blow through them. We had a very small staff, only 3 professional staff, and we could have used much more. They were overworked. Coming in, I didn't know that much about the geography of Michigan, besides the Metro Detroit geography where I lived in, but I'd never been to the Upper Peninsula. I'm happy to say I have now, but increased geographical training would have been great. Increased GIS software training would have been good. Office space, we've worked without office space this whole time. Use partisan fairness metrics from the beginning. We started drawing maps without the partisan fairness data. Once we got the partisan fairness data, we saw that those maps were terrible. So we had to start over with the partisan fairness data. And then really compromise. We had multiple instances where commissioners had to compromise with each other to get it done. Now, I'll give you guys one example. There's this area called Bay City in Michigan. And we had 2 very vocal groups of people say that their community of interest had Bay City being with one half of the state, and the other half of people said that Bay City belongs with the more urban part of the state. So, what do you do in that situation? Well, there are 2 things that we decided. One, we would look at communities of interest that also supported the rest of the constitutional criteria. So if there were 2 conflicting COIs, did one result in a more fair map versus another? Did one result in breaking up less township or county boundaries than another? If it did, we'd probably choose that one. But then also having some compromise. For example, we gave one group in Bay City their wish in the state Senate map, but gave the other group what they wanted in the state House map. So everyone got a little bit of what they wanted at the end of the day. Cool, and I think we have time for some Q&A. I've seen a few. We're paid 25% of the governor's salary, which ends up being about $40,000. We ended up at one of our first meetings, we ended up raising that to about 35% of the governor's salary to be $55,000. And we were working under that number, 55,000, until recently, about in October, we lowered it back down to the 25% margin, which is about $40,000 per year, because the majority of the work is done. It is a full-time job, but it's not, every week's not the same, right? There were some weeks, especially when we were mapping, where we were working literally 12 to 15 hours a day. But there are other weeks where we're working 2 hours a day. So I saw those pop up. I saw speaking. I'm happy to come out and speak. I'm not too far away from you guys. If you guys want to have me in person sometime, I'd love that. I really think that our model in Michigan could be used as a national model for redistricting, and I'd really like to advocate to see that happen. But yeah, Catherine, any other questions you want to shoot at me?
So I was really interested in one of the things that you said about diversity. And I wondered if there was anything in the Michigan Constitution about diversity and the commission, and whether you thought that would be a good idea.
So there was some geographical weighting to the random drawing, but there was no diversity weighting, which I think is something that might be good in the future to have, or if you guys are putting one together, you want a commission that's representative of your community. We have myself being an Arab American and 2 Black members, 2 Black women on the commission, but it might have been nice to have a Black man, or we have a very large Indian American population, a very large Native American population, a very large Asian American population. But, those were not represented by the commissioners. So I often took it upon myself to try to represent those groups, to the best of my ability, but I'm not a part of those groups, so I can only do that so well. So perhaps some diversity weighting to the applicant pool, and also some age weighting to the applicant pool would be good as well. Our average age is, I believe, 66 years old, which is fine, but I think it skews a little older. And it makes sense that's going to happen. You're asking people to take time off of their lives, time off from potential careers, starting a family, stuff like that, in order to essentially put a pause on their life for a really good cause, but a pause nonetheless. And that's not a decision many folks would make. It's probably the wise decision to not make that decision, but you gotta do what you gotta do. And there are ways to mitigate that, though, like you said, by weighting the applicant pool, by possibly taking a look at having a more livable wage to be associated with this, if it's going to be such a time-intensive process, and other factors as well.
So this was another thing that popped up. A couple different kinds of questions were about kind of the navigating staff, meaning the people that were helping you. Were they staff? Were they consultants? Did you have the resources that you needed? Were there challenges? For example, at this point, your commission is continuing, because of litigation. How, have you run into problems with ongoing payment? Like all of those kinds of questions.
Okay, so as far as the staff hiring, for our 3 main staff hires, for our executive director, our legal counsel, and our communications director, we put out applications on various state websites, and we just had an open application pool. I was the chair of one of those hiring committees, the executive director committee, so I'll speak to that one specifically. We had about, I believe it was about 70 applicants. And what I did was I took all the applications, I took everyone's name out the application. I wanted to do a non-biased run at it. So blinded all the applications, blinded them for myself and the other 2 commissioners that were on the subcommittee. We then ranked the applicants on a number of different factors. All of this information is still available on our website, by the way, for anybody to download. And then once we ranked them, we invited the 5 highest scorers to interview with us. And those interviews, like I said earlier, happened over Zoom, and we interviewed them in public. We got quite a lot of public feedback about each candidate. And then at the next meeting, we voted on who we wanted to hire. For our vendors, we undertook an RFP process. Now, it really wasn't that hard because only 2 vendors applied. So, it was a choice between the 2, and, one won out over the other. We also did another RFP process for litigation counsel, and only 1 firm applied to that one. So, when you only have 1 or 2 choices, it's not that hard, but more choices in the future would definitely have been good too. But the right people applied. We had national renowned experts. We had Bruce Adelson work as our VRA consultant. We had Election Data Services be our vendor. An RFP, it's a request for product, or request for
Proposal.
Proposal, yeah, request for a proposal. And it's like an official government thing that you put out for vendors to apply to. And all those applications are in public on our website as well. So if anyone wants to take a look, feel free to go through our archives, or even go look at the interviews. They're still up on YouTube, just like everything else.
Now, you had mentioned it was important to do open meetings. Did
Yeah.
and that in fact, you had an executive session or a closed meeting. What were the parameters after that litigation for closed meetings, and did you do any?
So all in all, the only time we're allowed to have a closed meeting is when we're discussing litigation with our counsel. And we've done that, I believe, 4 times in total out of the 100 over 150 meetings that we've had. Those 4 were private and closed off to the public. But like I said, that first one that we did, we actually ended up being sued by some of the news organizations around the state, and they won that lawsuit. So because of that lawsuit, the commission lost. So we had to publicly put out the recording of that meeting and all of everything that was talked about, all the materials for that meeting. And even at that meeting, there was never a want for us to do that private meeting. But when there's legalities involved, you want to err on the side of caution. But luckily, we haven't had to do it that much. But we really only try to do it when it's absolutely necessary, when we're discussing legal stuff that we wouldn't want our opponents on the other side or our friends on the other side, as they kept repeating in the more oral arguments last week, things we wouldn't want them to know.
So we have a bunch of kind of community mappers, folks that made maps, participated in hearings. And so one of the questions we got had to do with the districtor or district R. I'm never quite sure how we're supposed to say it. But whether in fact you have a page so that we could kind of look at the different maps and better understand your process.
So our public comment portal went on District R, but we used Autobound Edge, which was provided by Election Data Services. But every map that we created on Autobound Edge is on our website. So you can go to www.michigan.gov/MICRC and go to mapping data. And every single shapefile that we produced from the Autobound Edge GIS software is on there. So you're more than welcome to go and download all of the maps and do an analysis. You can do whatever you want with them. They're there for you guys to use however you want. And what you will see is we started off pretty rocky and got better as time went on. Our first maps, our first go at it, the maps just, aren't compliant. So it was our first go at it. But over time, they became more and more compliant. And then once we added partisan fairness numbers into the mix, they got even more compliant and came to a place that we could agree on.
Well, one of the things that we have in the Ohio Constitution is what we call representational fairness. It's basically a proportionality standard that looks at the previous decade, statewide elections of a previous decade. And with that, you can actually come up with the partisan index. In this case, we're talking about 54% Republican, 46% Democratic. How did, can you tell us a little bit about how you came up with what's disproportional and how, you know, what was the metric and what experts you talked to?
So we used those 4 metrics I spoke about: efficiency gap, mean median difference, cease to votes ratio, and lopsided margins test. And we wanted to make those as close to 0 as possible. Now, it's hard to make them completely 0, especially when you have a state, you know, as big as Michigan. You know, it's hard, but they were drastically skewed previously, and we were able to bring them to a number within 0 that the commissioners and our legal counsel was comfortable with. I mentioned Dr. Lisa Hanley before. She was one of our main advisors with that, pulling up different court cases on what the courts had accepted in the past as, you know, having fair partisan metrics. And, you know, we went under her advice, but, you know, we used 10 years of election data and created a composite from those 10 years. And that composite was about 52 Democrat to 48% Republican. But we didn't only look at the composite, we also looked at specific elections. And in Michigan, that was pretty easy to do because we flip-flop all the time. So we were able to look at our maps under the 2016 election where Trump won narrowly in Michigan. Then we were able to look at it under the 2018 election where it was a blue wave for the Democrats. And then we were able to look at it again for the 2020 election where Joe Biden won by a more narrow majority than in 2018. And we really want to make sure in each of those election years, the folks who got the most votes also got the most seats, regardless of whatever party they were on. That's how I'm pretty confident that, I said earlier, in years where Republicans get the most votes in Michigan, they will almost certainly get the most seats.
Well, I know we could continue to bend your ear. I don't know about you all, but I still have some questions. So we would love to invite you to come visit us in Ohio. And maybe come back on another one of these huddles so that we can ask you some more detailed questions. So I just want to be sure that everyone knew that we are going to be sending you the slides in the follow-up email, and I do think, you know, it takes a little while to digest all that good information. I did notice that there was a question that I did not get to that is actually for Mia. And this has to do with House Joint Resolution 6. Anthony, just so you know, this is a measure that would make it harder to pass a ballot measure. It goes from 50% plus 1 or simple majority to 60%. And the question is, Mia, okay, so it's dead for now. Will this pop up like, you know, some kind of scary monster in January?
Well, yes, when it comes to the Ohio legislature, I think we can count on things popping up like scary monsters. The question, I mean, and I don't, until they actually gavel out the 134th General Assembly, we're not going to count any chickens, but we do hope it's dead for this year. The question as to whether they can actually get it onto the May ballot if they have to start afresh in January, it's not impossible, but it will be very challenging for them in terms of the timeline. They'd have to rush it through every part of the process. And so the coalition that we built with, I think, 178 organizations and counting will stick together, and we will push back on any attempt to change the Ohio Constitution such that a minority of voters can dictate to the majority, you know, what we can or can't do in our Constitution. So thank you so much. I think you can see from the comments in the chat how deeply we admire the process that you went through and how jealous we are because we went through a traumatic process here in Ohio that did not come out well, despite our best efforts.
I'm familiar with your process, and it's very, I don't understand how it played out, and it's, you know, it's very unfortunate. You know, and I hope that, you know, people are always trying to take power from the people. So I hope that House bill does die. Our proposal proposal 2 in 2018, it passed by greater than 60%. I believe it passed by about 63%. But like you said, you never want a minority of voters, speaking for the majority. But hey, if any of y'all want to come to Michigan, we'll gladly take you.
And our constitutional amendments passed by over 70%, but that's another story. We also don't understand how we ended up here, but we are, we're going to live to fight another day and hope that we end up with a sane and fair process and sensible process like you have. So we deeply appreciate you joining us, and Catherine for introducing and helping with all the questions and things. And we are scheduled to have another huddle on January 14th. It's a Wednesday, 6 p.m. If that changes, we will let you know. But otherwise, thank you so much, and everybody have wonderful holidays. And we will see you in 2023. And
Well, big thank you to Anthony, and thank you all for joining us today. And for those of you who met us, at the State House yesterday, it's good to make a little bit of mischief. So I'm just so glad for everything that we've done together, and happy holidays to everybody. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Kwanzaa, and Hishmika for those who are celebrating that. We're just glad that we're in the season of the lights, and thank you so much, everybody.
Very good.